We're very lucky to have Chris Lonigan as our speaker. Chris is going to talk about evidence-based instructional strategies for promoting the development of early language and literacy skills for children at risk. He is Associate Director of the Florida Center for Reading Research at FSU, which is the preeminent place in the country for doing reading research. He's one of the most well-funded people in the country, and his research is absolutely top-notch. I've, of course, seen the talk, and it's very interesting data. So please help me welcome Chris Lonigan.
As I was sitting here listening to this morning's talk, I was wondering, what am I doing here, right? So I'm the literacy guy talking in a set of conferences where other people are talking about things like anxiety and conduct disorder problems and depression. And I was reminded the same thing I have to remind all of my clinical colleagues at Florida State University, that it's in the DSM. Right? So all of the reading disabilities, learning disabilities, math disabilities, language disabilities are part of the clinical constellation of problems that we see not only as clinical psychologists, but also when we work with children where they spend a lot of their time, and that's in schools. The other piece that's sort of interesting is when you start to look at the overlap of problems in academic performance and problems of what you would consider a more clinical nature. So for instance, the comorbidity between reading disability and ADHD is about 50%. There's also comorbidities between language problems and conduct problems, and it sort of crosses the gambit. So I am going to talk today about evidence-based instructional strategies for promoting the development of early language and literacy skills, sort of what we know right now and some experiences that we've had in terms of looking to improve these things and looking at how they are interrelated. And then I was thinking this morning, as I rewrite my talk continuously until I give it, that I should subtitle this talk, Things I Hope to Never Do Again. Right? So it's sort of a tour de force of research that I've been involved with over the years, and hopefully I can explain a little bit about why that is. Here's a brief overview, and here's what I sort of hope to talk about. We've seen a lot about meta-analysis. I'll talk a little bit about meta-analyses. We've seen some reports of individual studies. I'll talk a little bit about individual studies. So I want to talk just a little bit about types of evidence because I think it matters. Why the issue of academic skills, language, early literacy is so important. What are those skills, to sort of put on the table what it is that we're talking about. And then talk mostly about evidence for interventions, children who are at risk, a little bit about classroom curriculum, and in that context talk about response to instruction models. So in terms of talking about evidence, what does it really mean for something to be evidence-based, right? That's the theme of this conference. What are we talking about? And there's a couple different ways, particularly thinking about instructional approaches, that we can think about that. One is sort of simple. It follows from what we know about development, right? So it matches on to sort of our expectations about how skills are developed and in what sequence, and it pays attention to that. That might be evidence-based. The sort of higher bar of that is that the evidence suggests that using a particular instructional approach results in the outcomes that we want. So there's two things I think that are sort of important, and I have to credit somebody who gave a talk at the Institute for Education Sciences several years ago for pointing out the difference between these two terms. One is an effect, right? So we can have evidence that something shows an effect, and then the alternative is that the evidence shows that there is an impact. And those two things are different. So an effect is that we actually get the outcome that we want when we use the approach. And often the types of studies that do that are either quasi-experimental studies or uncontrolled studies where people just try the approach and something happens, and that something that happens is the outcome that we had hoped for and expected, so we got the effect. The problem is that we don't know what would have happened anyway, right? And you can see this a lot in schools, right? Because unlike a lot of clinical trials research, we don't have the ability to keep children at home and not educate them and see what would happen, right? So we don't have a waitlist control group, which would be interesting. You have little 5-year-olds, you can say, I'm sorry, you can't actually go to kindergarten this year because you're in the control group. So we don't have that, but what we do have is we have lots of different things going on in education environments, and children learn. And people often attribute that learning to what was done, but those things are effects. We don't actually know what children would have learned had they been exposed to a different approach or nothing at all. Maybe that learning was just part of development. So the other alternative is looking for impacts, and impacts are when a desired outcome is achieved in contrast to some other approach, and this is called counterfactual reasoning. It's sort of the basis for field trial research, particularly in education, but in other fields in mental health functioning and treatment. And in educational research is typically achieved by comparing outcomes between two or more groups, one of which gets one intervention or one instructional approach and one which gets the other. And the best case of this is when groups are formed initially by chance, and the way we do that is through randomization, because we just assign people by lottery, and any differences that are obtained are just there due to chance. So therefore, if we get large differences between groups, we can assume that it had something to do with what we did after randomizing. So that's the impact. And I think that's sort of important. You may not realize the importance of it for a while, but a lot of stuff in education is about effects, and mostly what I'm going to talk about today is about impacts. So what's really at stake here when we're looking at educational outcomes? And I'm going to focus mainly on reading, but other educational outcomes are important, math, certainly, and sort of all content area. But if we look at reading, we sort of know that reading skills provide the foundation for children's academic success. Children who read well read more, and because they read more, they start to acquire knowledge in numerous domains. And to just give you an example of sort of what reading more is like, these researchers, Nagy and Anderson, looked at avid readers and not so avid readers who were in middle school, and they estimated that the avid reader read about 10 million words a year versus the less avid reader or the less motivated reader who read about 100,000 words in that same year. So you can just sort of imagine the magnitude of the information being taken in by somebody who reads well and is motivated to do so and is interested in reading. They're acquiring huge amounts of additional knowledge beyond just sort of the reading practice. So what about children who are at risk? Well, it turns out that children who lag behind stay behind, right? Children who lag behind on reading skills tend not to get as much practice in reading than other children. They miss opportunities for developing reading comprehension strategies. They're frequently encountering reading material that is too advanced for their skills. And because of all this, they start to acquire negative attitudes about reading itself. They simply start not liking to read. I was thinking this morning when you were talking about depression sort of comes and then sort of goes away, that in education we're sort of lucky because, right, the problem doesn't go away all by itself. You have to do something about it. The children are unlucky. We're kind of lucky as researchers because it doesn't just go away. So this negative cascade of effects for children who are at risk or children who are not reading well is something that Keith Stanovich called the Matthew effect, where in reading, you might think that those who read better start to get more and more reading skills and start pulling away from their less literate peers because those children are not getting as much practice on other things. So you end up, not only does the gap stay the same, but it starts spreading apart. Lots of negative consequences about this. I already talked about the comorbid conditions, but certainly children who have problems reading early start to have other problems related to academic skills. They're typically referred for special education classes. Most children who are poor readers tend to have problems sort of completing high school or completing it well and going on to obtain a college degree. So I'm going to talk mainly about very early literacy in the preschool context. So why the preschool period? Well, there's an increasing recognition that the preschool period is really a critical point for prevention of later reading problems, right, if we seize the opportunity to do so. But instead of focusing on reading as we typically understand it, or what I'll call conventional literacy or conventional reading, we really need to focus on emergent literacy, and those are the precursor skills that are responsible for the development of later reading skills. So in the preschool period, interventions need to focus on emergent literacy because children are not yet engaged in conventional literacy. Most preschoolers don't read. So the questions you might ask are, what are the skills that are in this emergent literacy domain thing, and what are effective ways to intervene on those skills? And so I'm going to tell you a little about how we identified the evidence for this. So the National Early Literacy Panel, a lot of you have heard of the National Reading Panel, or the NRP, which produced a report. And after the NRP, there was a National Early Literacy Panel, which I was a part of. And we decided, or it was decided, that we would do a meta-analysis of what were the effective ways to promote early literacy skills for children, for preschoolers and kindergartners. And we really realized that because those children were not yet reading, that we had to do something different than the National Reading Panel, which was to first find out what were the skills we should be looking at. And this is one of the things I hope never to do, right, which is a really large meta-analysis again, because it sounds good, right? You get this panel together and you go to these exotic, interesting places to have meetings, and then you sit in a windowless hotel room and you read thousands and thousands of articles to come up with the meta-analysis. So it turns out not to be as fun as it sounds originally. So what we did is we screened over 7,000 published studies that had something to do with identifying what an early literacy skill or an emergent literacy skill would be. And each of those published studies eventually came through a filter, and we ended up with about 300 studies that we used, and all the studies involved some sort of predictive relationship between a skill that was measured when children were in preschool and some reading outcome, decoding, reading comprehension, or spelling, measured at some point later on when they were kindergarten, first grade, third grade. Several studies went all the way up into high school. Okay? So, and here's what we found. This is a summary of the predictive analysis to identify, which skills were good predictors of later reading skills. And down the left side are the things that were measured when children are in preschool: alphabet knowledge, do you know the names and sounds of letters; phonological awareness, which is the skill of can you manipulate the sounds and words so that it makes it easier to figure out how the letters go with those sounds. Concepts about print is basically understanding things about how print works. Then you have the rapid automatized naming variables, which is something that the field has been really interested in for a number of years, which is how quickly you can name letters or digits, which is the RAN, letters or digits, or objects and colors for younger children who may not yet know their letters. And it's sort of an interesting aside to that. We were among the first people to do that, and we discovered that preschoolers will often confuse the word fast with loud. So when you give this task, it's this array of letters or pictures in our case, and we say, we want you to name these as fast as you can. It's like a race. Start here and go down the rows. And they do it, it's common objects: a dog, a car, a tree, a man, and so on. And they just repeat. And we do it twice. We say, that was great. You're really good at this. We want you to do it one more time. And this time, we want you to do it really, really fast. And they're like, okay. And then you put the thing up, you put the little sheet up, and they're man, cat, dog. So I've always wondered what would happen if we actually measured the volume of speech and how that would relate to reading. But what we know is that children who can do these things faster have greater fluency in either naming letters and digits or objects and colors actually end up being better readers. Children who can write or write their name. And we have oral language skills, phonological short-term memory, visual perceptual skills, print awareness. And what's here is sort of these are the outcomes: decoding, reading comprehension, spelling. And if it has a double plus there, it means it was a really good predictor. If it has a single plus, it means it was a good predictor, sort of moderate in the effect sizes, as were talked about earlier. And a double minus means that it really wasn't all that great a predictor. So you can sort of see that these are rank ordered by how good of predictors they were for later decoding, and mostly for later reading comprehension, and they sort of fit in there for spelling. And then, because most of these were correlational studies, or what we would call zero-order correlational studies, we wanted to know, whether these things were independently predictive. So we looked at studies that included more than one variable, so 2, 3, or 4 variables simultaneously, and that's what's listed in the multivariate significance. So was alphabet knowledge predictive when you also looked at phonological awareness, oral language, or IQ, or other things? And if it's yes, it means that, yeah, that thing held up in there as an independent and important precursor or predictor of later reading skills. We then did a bunch of secondary analyses, as people who do meta-analysis have to do. And what we were primarily interested in is breaking down, I should back up, is breaking down the fact of sort of the surprising results that when you looked at oral language, it was not really the best predictor, which a lot of people thought it would be, and it was only sometimes significant in the multivariate analysis. So one of the secondary analyses we did was to look at how it was that these different oral language measures that were in the literature predicted either decoding outcomes, right, just being able to read words on the page, versus reading comprehension outcomes. And here's where we found where oral language really started to make a difference, is that it wasn't in the earliest form of beginning to read, decoding, being able to read words from the page, it was in the comprehension aspect. Probably not a huge surprise, but it's not that oral language is sort of very related to all forms of reading. It's really mostly related to reading comprehension, and that's shown by the difference in the correlational values and on the side here where it actually shows you when these things were statistically significant. And then we also found that it wasn't just vocabulary, which is what a lot of people in early childhood tend to think of. You know, we need to promote children's vocabulary. If you look at the things that were important, vocabulary are the things that are sort of least important. It was higher levels of oral language skills. So being able to use your vocabulary or having deep vocabulary that made a difference, right? So you can sort of think about this, that you need vocabulary, but it's not enough, right? So imagine trying to have a conversation with somebody who knew a lot of words, but didn't really have any grammar skills, right? It would be really hard to have a conversation with that person because they'd just be saying table, chair, and you're like, what? I don't understand. You're like, table, chair, right? Is you need not only vocabulary, but you need some way to put it together. You need grammar, you need depth of vocabulary knowledge so that you know which words to use. So you need to actually put together the whole package in terms of having good reading comprehension skills. Okay, so those are the things we need to sort of work on. Not just vocabulary and oral language, but sort of the full spectrum of oral language, including grammar, syntax, deep vocabulary knowledge, sort of the whole package of oral language. But for decoding, it's really alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, and some of the other what I'll call code-related skills, things that are important to learn to decode, and are also important for reading comprehension because you can't actually comprehend what you can't decode, but then you need to add the oral language piece on top of that in order to sort of have both decoding and reading comprehension. So the next phase of what the National Early Literacy Panel and other groups did was look for, what are the practices that promote these skills. And I'm going to focus primarily on two sources of reviews. One is the meta-analysis that was done by the National Early Literacy Panel, which looked at sort of breaking interventions down into these areas, code-focused, shared reading interventions, and oral language interventions. And then the U.S. Department of Education has something called the Works Clearinghouse, although some people have named it the Nothing Works Clearinghouse, because oftentimes it turns out that when you insist on quality of evidence, there are a number of things out there in the field that don't have the quality of evidence to support their use. Okay? But in the early childhood domain, the Works Clearinghouse looked at code-focused interventions, primarily about phonological awareness, shared reading intervention, and also preschool curricula. So in terms of code-focused interventions, and this is from the National Early Literacy Panel, or the NELP, and these are what's in this table and blank in your handout, are effect sizes for 4 different types of training: phonological awareness training only. I'll try this. Phonological awareness training plus alphabet knowledge training only, and what we called phonological awareness and phonics training, although it really was more sort of simple or rudimentary decoding. And the outcomes looked at were phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, oral language, reading and spelling as outcomes. And again, these are effect sizes, so these are the proportion standard deviation difference that the instructional or the intervention group scored above the control group, whatever the control group was in the study. And again, sort of the 0.2, the 0.3, the 0.4, 0.5, and above as being the small, medium, and large effect sizes. So what you can see is that when you try to do phonological awareness training, it's pretty effective. You get an effect size of 0.91 across 21 studies. The numbers in parentheses are the number of studies. When you do phonological awareness training and alphabet knowledge training, it's also, in those 18 studies, produced a large effect size. When you do it with this sort of rudimentary decoding, the 0.74 effect size in 19 studies. So it works on what you think it would work. Sort of the real test, if it would come up, is these last two columns, which is where the outcomes involved actual conventional literacy skills, reading and spelling. And you can see that depending upon the outcome, be it reading or be it spelling, the single interventions, so PA training only, seem to have a positive effect on spelling, but not so much on reading. Combining alphabet knowledge training with phonological awareness training seem to have a positive effect on both reading skills, and these are mostly decoding outcomes, and spelling outcomes. And when you combined it with the sort of rudimentary decoding aspects of phonological awareness training and sort of the rudimentary decoding, you had significant and reasonably large effect sizes on both decoding skills and spelling skills. Now, for those of you who are looking for like a thesis or a dissertation project or a project to do, the one thing that surprised us and the one thing that we expected to be overwhelming in the literature is that there'd be lots of studies of just training kids about the alphabet, right? Teaching them about the alphabet. Turns out that there's only like 3 studies in the literature at the point that we did this meta-analysis on that. And interestingly enough, not a single one of them looked at what the effect of that training was on alphabet knowledge. So I don't know what's going on with researchers. Perhaps they put the bugs back in or took them out and had no data left or whatever. Okay, so these code-focused interventions work not only on the targeted skills, but they also work on this later ability, these decoding, reading abilities and spelling abilities. And that's actually one of the reasons that people are safe in or feel safe in concluding that these underlying emergent literacy skills, particularly phonological awareness, are causally related to later reading skills, right? Because if you intervene on phonological awareness, you get improvement not only in phonological awareness, but you get improvement on reading and spelling skills later on. And it's not advancing. There we go. So we also looked, the National Early Literacy Panel also looked for differences in shared reading, because if you know the early childhood literature, you know that shared reading is almost like the chicken soup of early childhood, right? So whatever ails you, we'll do shared reading and then everything will be better. So there's a lot of studies on shared reading, you know, teachers sitting down reading books with children to promote something about early language or literacy. And what you can see here is that these are all the studies in the literature. 15 of them had oral language as the outcome. 4 had print knowledge and various other things. The effect sizes ranged from, pretty large and statistically significant to small and not significant for alphabet knowledge. The interesting thing is that none of these studies have actually looked at the impact of shared reading on conventional literacy skills. So what do we know about whether or not shared reading helps you develop reading skills? We don't know anything because there have been no studies on that. But we do know that it does have an effect on oral language, right? Which is one of the reasons that people tend to use it. And then there are 2 types of shared reading you can look at. One is a very interactive style of shared reading where it's really not so much reading as it is just talking about books. So teachers or parents engaging children in a dialogue about what's in a picture book. So maybe asking questions about, what's going on or what's shown in the pictures, and not so much reading. Actually, we should call this dialogic booking because it's really a dialogue about the book and it really doesn't even have to be a book. It can just be a picture. And then there are the sort of what you might think of as typical or, sort of the typical pattern of shared reading where the teacher just reads or the parent just reads or the adult reads and the children listen. Okay, so there's 2 types of shared reading, and what we found is, was that the more interactive style of reading produced a larger effect size than a non-interactive, which is probably not all surprising because in the interactive style, children are getting practice. They're talking. They're using their words. They're getting feedback. The teacher is able to evaluate what's going on. And this is probably somewhat misleading when people talked this morning about what the control group was. Most of these studies compare teachers reading the book with teachers not reading the book, right? No extra shared reading. So the treatment is really a no treatment control, whereas most of these studies, this is the control group, right? So it's almost the effect size would be the combination of that because dialogic reading is usually compared to typical shared reading. So that 0.59 is probably an underestimate of exactly how much effect you get in shared reading for oral language. Now you remember when we did the secondary analysis of predictors of later reading, we found that vocabulary, although important, was really not the most important predictor. So we broke down the shared reading interventions to sort of say, well, how many of them had vocabulary as the outcome and how many of them had those bigger components of oral language as the outcome, or here listed as the composite oral language. And what we found is that shared reading is primarily good at building vocabulary and not so good at building that stuff that's more important for the more complex forms of comprehension, like reading comprehension. So it's good, it works for oral language, it's primarily about vocabulary and not so much about syntax, grammar, and more, more depth of oral language knowledge. Okay, so that was the meta-analysis. That's something about the Works Clearinghouse, what they found. Actually, the Works Clearinghouse looked at those same things, and they used a different approach to categorizing evidence, and they just sort of declare things as effective or not effective, and all the things that the National Early Literacy Panel found as effective were also declared effective by the Works Clearinghouse. What I want to talk about is a little bit of sort of my research history, and that's looking at how some of these small group interventions built out of these components can work for children who are at various levels of risk for academic difficulties. And I'm going to talk initially about two studies. The first study I'm going to call, we sort of label studies, this one we called prevention, because we were trying to prevent later reading problems. And these children were 4-year-old children attending either the local school district's Title I pre-K program or the local Head Start program. Their classroom curriculum was either high scope or creative. And all these children who were assigned to do so received small group pull-out instruction for vocabulary, phonological awareness, or print knowledge. And it was really not an in-depth intervention. They got 10 or 15 minutes per day for about 12 weeks. So it's about 10 hours of intervention on top of what they were already getting in their classroom. And again, all these children are sort of at risk. The second study is on a group of children who were Spanish-speaking dual language learners or English language learners or language minority youth or whatever way you want to categorize them. So there were 94 children who were attending University Head Start program. Classroom curriculum was high scope. And these children, similar to the children in prevention, received small group pull-out instruction for vocabulary, phonological awareness, and print knowledge. And we were actually interested in what was the best way to do that? Did we do it in an English-only model when they just got the instruction in English? Or did we do it in sort of a transitional model where we started off in Spanish and then transitioned to English over the course of the intervention? The intervention here was a little bit longer. It's 20 minutes a day for about 20 weeks or about 30 hours of intervention. So the first one, 10 hours of intervention, sort of push in, pull out type of thing, not unlike what goes on in schools for children who are demonstrating some risk. And again, 10 hours versus 30. Here are the results of the prevention study, and looking in terms of the outcome measures, we have different types of vocabulary measures, receptive or expressive vocabulary. The effect sizes there are small but statistically significant. In terms of phonological awareness, the effect sizes are again small but statistically significant, and print knowledge, small but statistically significant. I should also point out that although Cohen sort of came up with the small, medium, and large effect sizes, those are completely arbitrary numbers that aren't based on sort of anything. It's just sort of like, well, what's a 0.2? And Jacob said small. And so now we all call it small. As a point of comparison, people estimate that the effect size for an entire year of elementary school would be about 0.2 or 0.25. Okay, so this is saying that although by classic definitions of small, medium, and large, children benefited from this small group intervention, they benefited close to the amounts that you would get from estimates of 1 year of elementary school. And remember, the comparison group are children who are getting what's going on in their classroom, right? So they're sort of closing the gap, so to speak, by close to about 1 year of elementary school, even though the effect sizes are small. When we look at the effect for now the study with the Spanish-speaking English learners or dual learners, we see the effect sizes have jumped up. Now they're moderate and statistically significant in terms of oral language on vocabulary and definitional vocabulary, now moving closer to those sort of more complex forms of oral language. Phonological awareness, the effect sizes are even larger, and print knowledge, again, right? So this intervention worked for this group of children. Again, the comparison group are children who are participating in Head Start, getting all of the classroom instruction, whatever that is that children get in Head Start. Now, the alternative intervention actually produced slightly larger effect sizes. Now, we're in the large range. So if you believe the sort of estimate that an effect size of 0.25 is what you would expect for an academic year of children in elementary school, we're doubling that or tripling that with these interventions. And for this one, actually leveraging children's knowledge of Spanish at the outset resulted in better outcomes than just doing it in English for vocabulary and print, but not for phonological awareness. It didn't make a difference there. Okay. So what does that mean in terms of what has happened to these children, right? Effect sizes are all well and good, right? Some of the labels are arbitrary. Some of them may be something like what a child would get out of 1 year of elementary school. These are standardized scores from the measures that we ultimately used in the study. This is table 4 out of the publication of this. And these are the pre-tests for the different groups on definition of vocabulary, phonological awareness, and print knowledge when the children came in. And right, if you're used to standard scores, you know that anything below 85 is below average. So in most domains, these children were in the below average range at this outset of the study when we first encountered them in the fall of the year. And that was true for all domains, or almost all domains except for print, where they were sort of close to the bottom end of average, and all the different groups. But then after getting just, that little bit of intervention, particularly for the transitional group, now we've pushed all the children up into the solidly average range on these standardized measures, right? So they've gone from being an at-risk group, scoring below average on standardized measures of early language and literacy, to essentially looking like almost an unselected population of children, right? So we kind of removed their risk with that intervention, and it wasn't that much. It was 30 hours, or 20 to 30 hours for each child across the course of an academic year. Now here's the part where people usually gasp in horror. And it's the second piece of the Works Clearinghouse review of preschool literacy, early childhood interventions, and it's looking at what they found for preschool literacy curriculum. And unlike the National Early Literacy Panel, the Works Clearinghouse looked everywhere for any literature. So published literature, stuff published in books, stuff published on people's websites, things that your uncle knew about were sitting in somebody's attic somewhere, right? The Clearinghouse went out and found those things, right? So review of any and all published and unpublished studies of preschool curricula. The requirement for the Clearinghouse at the time was that the studies yielded causally interpretable evidence. They produced impacts, not effects, okay? So they had to be group design, they had to have an appropriate comparison group, which meant that they either had to be randomized or they had to be a well-constructed quasi-experimental study. And in Clearinghouse language, that means you had to demonstrate group equivalence before the study, right? And a lot of quasi-experimental studies don't do that. So high on methodology, wide on the catchment for studies, past 20 years with the idea that if something was studied 20 years ago, it's probably changed since then. So we'd want to look for the newer version of it. And this is something that's updated continuously. So the first round was completed in about 2007, and most recent update, I think, was July or August of 2010. Okay, here's the list of things, right, that we know are curricula that we could find absolutely no studies for, right? No studies, and there are some things here that you might be surprised about. High scope, Houghton Mifflin pre-K, Scholastic Early Childhood, right? There are not things here that are, this is something somebody built in their garage and they haven't done a study on it, right? These are some of the most widely used pre-K curricula out there. And that's important, right? Because if, these are things that children who are at risk of later reading problems are getting as their curriculum, and we don't know anything about them because there are no studies that pass that bar of providing causally interpretable information. There were another group of studies that the Clearinghouse could find studies for, but they weren't interpretable, right? So they didn't produce causally interpretable evidence. And there's a lot, right? High scope is, a different version of high scope is on there, DLM, Early Childhood Express, and so on, right? Not unfamiliar names. And then the very smallest list, as you might expect, right? Big list, big but kind of smaller list. Here are the studies, here are the preschool curricula that actually have interpretable studies, right? And what are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 on there. And rather than showing effect sizes, what's in here is sort of, again, the plus, or the 0, or the dashed lines. So the 0 means that this was done in a causally interpretable study, and the effect size was not statistically different from 0. The plus means that there was at least one study that found that it looked like the use of that curriculum resulted in better outcomes than the use of an alternative curriculum. The double pluses means that there was even stronger evidence, and the dashes mean that there was no evidence in that domain. So what you see here is basically a picture of, we don't know a lot about what's going on in the classrooms of children in preschool, and that includes children who are at risk because most of the curricula haven't been studied. Of those that have been studied, the evidence is not particularly good in terms of saying that that curriculum works better than another curriculum, although I have to point out that these are not no treatment controls. These are an alternative curriculum, right? So it's just that these don't work better than the alternative. But again, sort of the common one on here, so Creative has, I think, one study showing that it was no better than the alternative. Not a good picture. So if I can just summarize sort of where I've been so far to sort of figure out where I'm going to end up. We know that there are several key emergent literacy skills, and these things are amenable to instruction. So alphabet knowledge, phonologic awareness, and oral language, but it's important that it's not just vocabulary, it's vocabulary and beyond. There are, in fact, a number of empirically supported instructional practices. Most of those involve teaching something about phonological awareness. That's usually better when it's combined with teaching about print somehow. It's even better when it's combined with something that looks more like early reading, but really isn't teaching children to read. It's just teaching them how to combine letters for common words to read, essentially. All right, it's kind of like teaching reading. And there's evidence for those interventions that they have impacts on conventional literacy skills. Shared reading is effective. It's better when it's this interactive dialogic reading. It's mostly effective for vocabulary, but in that case, we don't know that it has any effect on conventional literacy outcomes, reading comprehension, or spelling. And there's something important about the studies that have been done in most cases is that the effective practices have not been studied when they've been done as sort of whole class interventions, right? So it's not one teacher and 25 kids using a book saying, who can tell me about this book? Right? It's usually a teacher and small groups of 3 to 5 children. So working more intensively, which is good because it allows teachers to individualize to individual children and their strengths and needs. So the evidence mostly comes from use of small group instruction or one-on-one instruction. And importantly, all this is really scaffolded instruction, so the activities are really keyed to a child's current developmental level, sort of shooting for what you might expect as the standard of where you want children to be by the end of their pre-K or K year, not sort of starting there. Since I just showed you this should not come as a surprise. Most commercially available preschool curricula have no evidence of positive impacts, and that includes all of the most commonly used curricula. And some preschool curricula have evidence for positive impacts, or actually lack of positive impacts. And even among those that have evidence, most have only a limited number of emergent literacy domains on which they show evidence. So as most of you who work in schools know, right, the current buzz is response to instruction. And unlike what John Weiss was saying earlier, where we develop these great interventions and then people don't use them in the field, right, we have almost the opposite problem in education, where people sort of half develop an intervention and then everyone uses it in the field, right? And I think maybe one of those things is response to instruction. And response to instruction is actually 2 things. It's a way to identify children as eligible for special education, right, where the reauthorization of IDEA got rid of sort of the idea of discrepancy, where if your achievement didn't match your IQ, you could be classified as having learning disability. Now children must be substantially below average in a skill area and make little progress in the context of high quality education, right? So they don't respond to instruction. The other, which I think kind of makes a lot of sense, and one of the reasons that people went to response to instruction, is it's seen as a tiered model of educational programming where the intensity of instruction increases either in sort of the frequency or smaller group sizes as children don't demonstrate a positive response to the lower tier. So the idea is that sort of in tier 1, or what goes on in the classroom, most children, 75% or so, their educational needs will be met, but there'll be a percentage of children who don't, and they go on to tier 2 or tier 3. All right, so both models require frequent progress monitoring, and they assume that an evidence-based effective tier 1 classroom curriculum is in place, and that there are evidence-based interventions available for those for whom that isn't sufficient. So one of the things that we've also done is looked at how this might work in preschool, and I'm going to close talking about 2 studies conducted in the local school district's preschool program, Title I, serving high-risk children. We did an earlier curriculum study, and they had actually changed their curriculum to one of the ones that had evidence of effectiveness, so they had good tier 1 instruction. And the question is in the context of that, can we improve upon that high quality for the bottom 20% of children? So in the first study, we measured children at the beginning of the fall. They were all in these classrooms getting great instruction as part of their classroom. And then within the domains of early literacy, we looked for children who were scoring below the 20th percentile at the middle of the year, right? So the idea is that the classroom instruction is not enough to push them into the average range, so they might need something else. We identified 89 eligible children. They could qualify on the basis of language skills, print skills, phonological awareness, or any combination, and children who are above the 20th percentile were simply not eligible. All these children got small group pull-out interventions from February to May. This is essentially just like the earlier 2 studies that I talked about. So the interventions were almost identical to the prevention intervention or the ELL study that I talked about. So here's sort of the timeline. They get a fall assessment. We just follow them. They get a mid-year assessment, after which they are classified as either eligible or not eligible, depending on whether or not they are at or below the 20th percentile, and then they get 11 weeks of intervention. We come back and assess them. Here are the results. And if you can see this, you would see that these effect sizes are small and not significant. And if you know me, I've done a lot of intervention studies. This is the first time I've ever done an intervention study and didn't get an effect. So there was no impact of this tier 2 intervention, despite the fact that it was identical to what we had gotten effects for before. So we gave up. No, we didn't. We said, okay, so let's try something even more intensive. Let's try smaller groups. Let's try more time allocated on the basis of specific qualifications, more time devoted to each skill, increased depth of instructional activities, so we're not going to do as many skills. We're going to do fewer skills with more repetition, much more scaffolding. Same model as the study 1, more children this time. We had 256 children identified as eligible, and of course we had made tier 2 more intense, right? 3 children, more intervention time each day, so on and so forth. And here are the results. And what happened is now we got the effect, right? We went back to the effects being at least small or moderate, but statistically significant, sort of similar to what we had obtained back in that population and prevention. The other thing, we sort of looked at whether we had these effects on our general measures or our target measures. Unsurprisingly, the things that we're specifically targeting showed the biggest effects. So the conclusion is that we actually can had significant impacts of a tier 2 intervention when we intensified it. The problem was that in the context of a high quality and empirically supported tier 1 instruction, the classroom model, you really needed to use a very intensive tier 2 instruction to get any benefit for the children who were failing to benefit from the classroom instruction. And the largest impacts were on the specific targets of the intervention. So this is why I think sort of one of the conclusions is there are lots of things out there we can do. The conclusion is that we can just push it forward into an RTI model for these children is that we end up with very different populations, right? So most of the early studies looking at interventions for children at risk were just general risk populations, children who are at risk because of where they live, their family income, sort of some of their initial skills, but there had been no intervention instructional tryouts. Right? Once children had gone through that instruction and were still scoring at low levels, they looked like a fundamentally different population, a more disabled population, children who were much more at risk, and you therefore needed to increase in intensity. The other problem, of course, is that a lot of children in these classrooms will qualify, and that will make doing RTI sort of hard, particularly in preschool. So I will end by saying that what I just said is that a lot of things work. We know that teachers can do this with adequate support, and we need to understand that different children have different needs, and we need to understand who the population is that we're serving, because we really do need to match what it is that we're doing with them to what their needs are. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.